Margaret Wilson sat in her favorite chair by the window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, watching the autumn wind scatter golden leaves across the quiet Vermont street. The house was still, almost too still, and she felt the weight of years pressing softly against her shoulders. It was one of those afternoons when time seemed to slow, when every small sound, the creak of the floor, the ticking of the clock, the distant laughter of children outside, felt sharper, as if life itself had slowed just to remind her she was still here, still breathing, still waiting. Margaret had spent decades filling her days with routines, tending her small garden, baking bread that smelled like home, reading novels that transported her to places she could no longer travel, and keeping herself company with the memories of a life both full and lonely. She had learned to find comfort in quiet, to embrace the stillness as though it were an old friend, but that calm was fragile, easily broken by something small yet significant, like a knock at the door or the sound of familiar footsteps. And on this particular afternoon, as the wind tossed the last few leaves against the porch, the door opened, and there he was, Ethan, her 16-year-old grandson, tall and awkward in the way teenagers always are, his hoodie slightly too big, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. There was something in his posture, the way he hesitated at the threshold, that immediately told her this was not a casual visit. He cleared his throat softly, a small sound that carried the weight of something important, and said, "Grandma, can we talk?" Margaret felt a sudden stir in her chest, a mixture of surprise and quiet anticipation, because people only asked to talk when their hearts were heavy or their minds were full of questions they couldn't answer alone. She gestured to the chair across from her, and he sat, still uneasy, still searching for the right words. She watched him, noticing the way his fingers tapped nervously against his thighs, the way his gaze shifted between the floor, the walls, and her face, as if he was trying to measure her reaction before daring to speak. The house seemed to shrink around them, the ticking of the clock louder now, the shadows of the trees outside stretching across the wooden floor, making the room feel both intimate and endless at the same time. Ethan drew in a deep breath, and for a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and meaningful. Then he began to speak, slowly, carefully, each word deliberate, almost like he was afraid to break the fragile bubble of trust that had just formed. I think I'm scared of loving someone," he admitted, and Margaret's heart tightened, because she recognized that fear all too well, the kind of fear that comes from knowing the heart can be both a source of joy and deep pain. She waited, letting him continue, feeling the way the air between them seemed charged with unspoken emotions, with memories of her own youth, with the invisible threads that connected generations through love, loss, and longing. "I don't want to end up alone," Ethan confessed, and Margaret felt a pang of recognition, as though she were hearing the echo of her own past fears spoken out loud by someone she loved dearly. Then he looked at her, his eyes wide, searching, and asked a question that pierced through her carefully constructed calm. "Mom says you were once really in love. But you never talk about it. Why?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard, and felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest, a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow. She had not expected this. She had expected complaints about school, questions about homework, maybe even some teenage drama, but not this, the quiet, piercing honesty of a young heart seeking answers about life, love, and choices. The words of her grandson became a mirror, reflecting back memories she had tucked away, memories of a man named Daniel Harper, the love she had held and let go in her 20s, the letters she had kept, the promises whispered and broken by circumstance, the warmth and the heartbreak that had shaped her. Margaret realized that in this small moment, in the quiet of her living room with leaves swirling outside, she was facing not just her grandson's questions, but her own past, the choices she had made, the love she had denied herself, the longing she had hidden behind years of careful living. Ethan shifted in his seat, still hesitant, and she could sense that he was waiting, not just for words, but for permission to understand, to accept, to learn from the life of someone who had loved and lost yet kept living. Margaret felt an unexpected closeness to him, a bridge between generations built on trust, emotion, and the shared human experience of longing and fear. And in that moment, the ordinary afternoon became extraordinary, charged with the possibility that something small, one conversation, one question, one brave admission, could awaken memories, stir emotions, and open doors long closed. She nodded slowly, motioning for him to continue, and in the gentle quiet of that living room, with the wind whispering outside and the amber sunlight casting warm patterns across the floor, the first chapter of a conversation began, one that would change the course of both their lives, one word at a time. Margaret did not yet know how deeply this talk would reach into her heart, nor did she know that the fear and honesty of a 16-year-old boy could stir reflections and desires she thought she had buried forever. But as Ethan's voice filled the room, steadying with each confession, Margaret realized she was ready to listen, ready to remember, ready to feel again. And as the sun dipped lower, leaving streaks of pink and gold across the walls, Margaret sensed that this quiet Sunday, this simple invitation to talk, would mark the beginning of a journey, not just for Ethan, but for her, for a love long forgotten, for memories that refuse to fade, and for the subtle, powerful truth that it is never too late to confront the past and embrace the heart's longing. Ethan's voice trembled slightly, but he held Margaret's gaze, the intensity in his young eyes making her realize that this conversation was more than curiosity, it was trust, raw and unfiltered, and Margaret felt a mixture of protectiveness and awe as she waited for him to continue. I don't know why, but I'm scared of loving anyone, he said, each word carefully measured, as if he were testing the air between them before letting his fears fall into it, and Margaret's heart ached because she knew that fear well, a fear that had shadowed her own choices decades ago, a fear that could turn life into a series of cautious steps instead of leaps, a fear that could make a person settle for comfort over passion. She nodded, encouraging him to speak, and he drew a shaky breath. The room quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional whistle of wind through the trees outside, the sunlight slanting in amber stripes across the floor, warming the space but not enough to chase away the tension between them. I just don't want to be alone when I grow up, he said finally, and Margaret felt an unexpected jolt, a deep recognition, because those words were both simple and profound, and they carried the weight of a boy on the brink of understanding his own heart, a boy who already sensed the loneliness that life sometimes delivered even in the middle of love. Margaret reached out instinctively, placing her hand gently over his, and he flinched slightly but did not pull away, the contact grounding him, reminding both of them that connection was real, that family could be a refuge in uncertain times, that emotions did not have to be faced alone. Ethan's next words hit Margaret like a sudden gust of wind. Mom says you were in love once, that you had someone you cared about a lot. But you never talk about him. Why? Margaret's throat tightened, and she felt a wave of memories crash over her, memories of Daniel Harper, his easy smile, the letters he wrote that smelled faintly of cedar and ink, the nights they spent talking under starlight, the dreams they shared that seemed impossible yet beautiful, and the heartache of letting go when life demanded she choose practicality over passion, stability over risk, responsibility over desire. Ethan's gaze held her, wide and questioning, and Margaret realized that this boy, her grandson, was asking not for stories, but for truth, for understanding, for guidance, and she felt a strange mix of vulnerability and courage rising within her as she prepared to speak, knowing that the words she chose could leave echoes that would stay with him forever. She inhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch, letting the sunlight warm her face, letting herself remember every detail she had tucked away, and then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. I was afraid, Ethan. Afraid of losing him, afraid of needing him, afraid of the way love can change everything if you let it in. And she saw his eyes widen, saw the curiosity and empathy mix with something new, an awareness that life was more than rules and safety, that emotions were complicated, that courage sometimes meant following your heart even when the path was uncertain. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, listening, absorbing each word as if it were a lifeline thrown across generations, and Margaret realized that in sharing her own story, she was not only guiding him, but rediscovering parts of herself she had thought lost, parts of herself that still longed for connection, for tenderness, for the small, quiet joys that love could bring even decades later. She told him about the letters, the stolen moments, the laughter that had felt like sunlight on her skin, the heartbreak that had left a hollow ache she carried like a shadow, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not judge, only watched, occasionally nodding, occasionally drawing in a breath as if he were feeling the story in his chest, learning from her mistakes and victories alike. Did it hurt a lot? He asked softly, the question barely audible, and Margaret nodded, a lump forming in her throat, because it had hurt, more than words could carry, but also because the pain had taught her resilience, had taught her how to hold herself with gentleness and care even when life demanded sacrifices. Yes, she admitted, it hurt, but it also showed me how much love can shape a life, how much it can teach you about yourself, about courage, about honesty, about the things that truly matter. And Ethan's hand twitched slightly where hers rested upon it, as if he were absorbing not only the story but the warmth, the strength, the vulnerability, the human truth in her words, and Margaret felt a strange but comforting pride, realizing that this conversation might help him face his own fears when the time came. The afternoon passed in quiet intensity, punctuated by small sounds, the clink of her teacup against the saucer, the rustling of leaves outside, the occasional distant laughter of children, but the emotional rhythm between them grew stronger, faster, more urgent, as if the years separating them had melted away in the presence of honesty and trust, and Margaret sensed that this moment, ordinary on the surface, was extraordinary in its depth, a bridge between past and present, between two hearts learning the same lesson in different ways, that fear does not have to control life, that vulnerability can be strength, and that love, though complicated, messy, sometimes heartbreaking, is always worth understanding, worth honoring, worth taking a risk for. And Ethan, 16 and fragile in his own way, was learning this not from books or rules but from lived truth, from someone who had walked the path before him. She told him how she had let go, how life had moved forward, how she had built a family, how she had loved in quiet ways while carrying the memory of Daniel like a sacred flame, and Ethan nodded slowly, as if each word stitched a patch of courage into his own young heart, as if the room itself had become a safe space for questions and answers, for confessions and lessons, for truths that only emerge when the soul is ready to hear them. Margaret felt a tear prick at the corner of her eye but blinked it away, unwilling to let emotion interrupt the flow of this delicate, transformative dialogue, knowing that Ethan needed clarity, not performance, needed honesty, not theatrics, and she continued, letting words flow naturally, letting stories mingle with wisdom, letting past regrets illuminate the present, letting the silence between sentences speak as loudly as her voice, until finally Ethan leaned back, a soft exhale escaping him, a mixture of relief, understanding, and quiet gratitude in his expression, and Margaret realized that they had reached a point neither of them had expected, a moment of connection so pure, so real, that it transcended age, that reminded her of the enduring power of love and memory, that promised a deeper bond, a shared courage to face life with hearts open despite fear, a bond that would guide them both long after the autumn leaves had fallen, long after the moment passed, long after the world outside had moved on, because sometimes, a simple conversation, a question asked with trust, can awaken truths, heal old wounds, and light the way for the future in ways no one can anticipate. And Margaret, looking at Ethan now, realized that not only had he asked for guidance, he had reminded her that love, though fragile, though risky, though complicated, was still alive in her own heart, still capable of teaching, still capable of transforming. And in that room, in that golden light, with the wind outside carrying the scent of fall and the promise of change, both grandmother and grandson felt the quiet, profound magic of honesty, the way one voice can echo across decades, and Margaret knew, without words, that this moment would never be forgotten. That night, after Ethan had gone to his room, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house filling the quiet, and she couldn't shake the memories that had stirred during their conversation, memories that felt both familiar and painful, like old photographs suddenly brought to life. She wrapped her hands around a steaming cup of tea, the warmth grounding her, while the glow of the lamplight cast shadows that seemed to dance along the walls, and she realized that talking to Ethan had opened a door she hadn't dared approach in decades, a door to her past, to the man she had loved and lost, to Daniel Harper, whose name carried the weight of both longing and regret, and she found herself thinking about him not as a distant memory, but as a living presence, a chapter of her life she had tucked away too carefully, fearing both the joy and the ache it could bring. Her fingers absently traced the edge of the cup as she remembered his smile, the way he laughed like the sun was always shining, the soft warmth of his hand in hers during long walks through autumn streets, the letters he had written in his delicate, careful script, each one a testament to feelings he never rushed, a mirror of the love she had once felt and tried to contain. And she realized now how much of herself she had left behind in those letters, how much courage she had surrendered to fear, how much passion had been buried beneath years of responsibility and routine, leaving her life safe but quieter, emptier in ways she had only just begun to notice. She recalled the last night she had seen him, how they had stood under the stars, talking in whispers, promising forever in words they both knew were fragile against reality, and the hollow ache of letting go, the decision to step back when the world demanded she choose stability, and how that choice had shaped everything afterward, the marriage she had built, the children she had raised, the decades that had passed like leaves floating down a river, carrying pieces of her heart with them, leaving both satisfaction and longing in their wake. Margaret's mind wandered to Ethan's words, "I don't want to end up alone," and she realized that her grandson had unknowingly unlocked something within her, a reminder that love, even when it hurts, is a force that shapes lives, that teaches resilience, that can never truly be erased, and that perhaps, even now, decades later, there was a path not yet closed, a possibility she had not considered, a gentle, careful hope that life could still surprise her with connection, with warmth, with the rekindling of old dreams. She opened an old drawer, the one she had avoided for years, and there it was, a faded envelope with Daniel's name written in familiar, elegant ink, tucked between letters from friends long gone and photographs that had yellowed with age, and her heart skipped, unsure whether it was hope or fear rising inside her, whether opening it would bring solace or heartbreak, and yet she knew she could not ignore it any longer, that some questions demanded answers, that some emotions refused to stay buried, that life had a way of reminding us of what we once loved when we least expect it. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the envelope, feeling the texture of the paper, the subtle folds from years of handling, the ghost of his handwriting, and she felt a connection across time, across choices, across decades, a whisper of the man she had loved so deeply, a reminder that the past never truly leaves us but waits quietly for acknowledgement, for acceptance, for courage to meet it again. She thought about Ethan, about the courage it had taken for him to speak, to admit his fears, and she realized that in guiding him, she was also guiding herself, that the lessons of love, loss, and bravery were not one way, that the heart could teach even when it had grown older, and that perhaps, through this small act of honesty, she was learning to embrace herself fully, to acknowledge both regret and longing without shame, to recognize that even in the quietest corners of life, emotions remain alive and capable of change. Margaret imagined what it would feel like to write to Daniel, to reconnect in whatever way time would allow, to let words flow that had been trapped for decades, to feel the stirring of possibility and anticipation, and she wondered if he had ever thought of her, if he had carried memories of her quietly, as she had of him, if the years had softened the ache and kept alive the warmth, and she realized that it was this very uncertainty, this delicate balance between hope and fear, that made life vivid, that made emotion powerful, that made hearts willing to risk and dare again. She pictured the letters, the envelopes, the careful words that might bridge years, miles, and circumstances, and the thought both terrified and exhilarated her, because love had always been that way, messy, unpredictable, capable of deep sorrow and profound joy, yet never diminished by time, only shaped by it, strengthened in some ways, fragile in others, yet always a force that demanded acknowledgement, respect, and courage. Margaret's gaze drifted to the window, to the trees swaying in the night wind, to the stars beginning to peek through the darkening sky, and she realized that life, even in its quietest moments, was alive with potential, that decisions made decades ago did not erase the capacity for connection today, that the heart is patient, resilient, and capable of renewal even when it feels impossible, that memories can heal as much as they hurt, that longing is not a sentence but a signal, and that the smallest spark, a question from a grandson, a remembered letter, a quiet reflection, can ignite a journey toward rediscovery. She thought of Ethan's openness, his vulnerability, and it gave her courage, a gentle push to confront emotions she had avoided, a reminder that love is not bounded by age, that the heart's capacity is endless, and that her own story, once paused by fear and circumstance, could continue in unexpected, beautiful ways. Margaret lifted the envelope, feeling the weight of years, the thrill of memory, the possibility of what might be, and she allowed herself to imagine opening it, reading the familiar lines, feeling Daniel's presence in her hands and mind, letting hope mingle with remembrance, letting her own heart respond, letting herself be moved by the enduring truth that love, once known, never truly leaves, that it waits for acknowledgement, that it teaches, shapes, And sometimes offer second chances even when life seems long past the time for romance, even when the world has shifted in ways we cannot control, and that the courage to feel, to act, to reconnect, begins in small, tender moments, like the one she had shared with Ethan that afternoon, like the moment her fingers brushed the envelope, like the quiet awareness that life still has room for emotion, for reflection, for revival, for love. Margaret sat back in her chair, holding the envelope carefully, imagining the letter inside, imagining the conversation she might write, imagining the life that could unfold if she allowed herself to take one step forward, if she allowed herself to embrace the past without fear, if she allowed herself to be guided by both memory and hope. And she felt a strange, delicate joy, a sense of anticipation, a subtle heartbeat of possibility that made her realize that this night, this quiet reflection, this stirring of old emotions, was not just about loss or longing, but about rediscovery, about the courage to reconnect with life, with love, with oneself, and about the gentle but powerful ways in which one moment, one memory, one decision, can shift the course of a life forever, leaving Margaret both humbled and exhilarated, ready to face whatever might come next. The days after that night felt different to Margaret, as if a quiet shift had passed through her house, through her thoughts, through the rhythm of her life. She noticed little things she had overlooked before, the way sunlight hit the kitchen counter in the morning, the soft sound of leaves brushing against the window, the distant laughter of children outside, and in each small detail, she found a sense of possibility she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, as though talking to Ethan had not only opened a door in his young heart but also in hers, reminding her that life, even in its later chapters, could still hold surprises, still offer chances to embrace old dreams, still teach lessons about courage, about hope, about love that had never truly faded. She found herself thinking about Daniel constantly, the man who had once been the center of her heart, imagining what it would be like to reconnect with him, to speak again after decades of silence, to hear his voice and see if the warmth she remembered still lingered in his eyes. And though a part of her feared disappointment, a part of her thrilled to the idea that the past was not irretrievable, that the life she had lived, rich with family and routine, had not extinguished the capacity for emotion, that memory itself could bridge the years if she allowed it. And she realized that this was the gift Ethan had given her without even knowing it, the courage to feel again, to hope, to consider the unexpected. She walked through her house differently now, carrying both the weight of memory and the lightness of anticipation, noticing the photographs she had avoided, touching the frames as though the images could speak to her, letting herself remember not just the sadness of loss but the sweetness of love once shared, letting the warmth linger in her chest without judgment, without fear, simply as proof that the heart remembers, that it never truly forgets, and that sometimes the smallest gestures, the simplest questions, can awaken a lifetime of feelings long held dormant. She imagined writing a letter to Daniel, drafting lines in her mind that conveyed both the years past and the respect she had carried for him all along, the gratitude for what they had shared, the honesty about what had been lost, the humility to admit that time and circumstance had shaped but not erased the love between them. And in imagining those words, she felt a trembling excitement, a pulse of hope that life could still surprise her, that a connection thought closed could be renewed, that love, though tempered by experience, could still bloom in unexpected ways. Margaret thought of Ethan again, his sincerity, his willingness to expose his own fears, and she realized that guiding him had guided her, that teaching courage was inseparable from living it, that even at 72, the heart's capacity for bravery and tenderness remained, and that vulnerability could lead not to weakness but to freedom, to clarity, to the reclamation of joy she had thought belonged only to youth. She pictured the moment of sending the letter, imagining the postmark, the way Daniel would hold it in his hands, the anticipation in both their hearts, the words bridging decades of silence, the possibility of a conversation rekindled. And in that vision, she felt both nervous and alive, knowing that life's richness often comes in these delicate balances of fear and hope, risk and reward, remembering and moving forward. And she recognized that this was what love had always demanded, that the heart's journey was never truly complete, never entirely predictable, and never bound by time. The thought of embracing the past while holding on to the present made her feel profoundly connected to everything around her, to the house that had been witness to her life, to the garden that bloomed season after season, to the memory-laden furniture that held the imprint of laughter and tears, to the soft ticking of the clock marking moments she could choose to fill with courage, with tenderness, with action, with possibility, and she realized that life, though finite, held infinite chances to honor emotion, to reconcile regret, to act on longing, to let hope guide even the most careful, measured steps. Margaret's mind drifted back to the afternoon with Ethan, to the honesty he had shown, to the trust he had placed in her, and she felt an overwhelming tenderness for him, a desire to protect and nurture, but also a deep respect for the way youth could see what age sometimes obscures, the ability to remind older hearts of what they have kept hidden, and she understood that the love she had for him was not separate from the love she still felt for Daniel, that both were expressions of a heart willing to care, to feel, to reach beyond fear, and that they were interconnected in ways she had only begun to comprehend. She imagined the conversation she might have with Daniel if he replied, the laughter, the gentle teasing, the shared memories, the acknowledgement of what was lost and what remained, the quiet, tender moments that had never truly ended because the heart preserves its treasures, and she realized that even if the reply never came, even if circumstances prevented a full reunion, the act of reaching out, the willingness to try, had already changed her, had already softened her, had already opened space for joy, for reflection, for emotional renewal, for the acceptance that life's beauty lies in both action and intention, in courage and hope, in remembering without being trapped by the past, in loving without guarantees, and in trusting that connection, once real, endures in ways beyond control. She pictured herself standing at the mailbox, the crisp Vermont air on her skin, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands, and she felt a shiver of anticipation, a pulse of nervousness, a thrill that only comes when the heart dares to act, and she smiled, imagining the possibilities, knowing that life's quiet magic often hides in these small, deliberate gestures, that bravery can be gentle yet profound, and that the future is shaped not just by chance but by choices made with honesty, with courage, with heart. Margaret thought of her family, of Ethan's own journey, of the lessons she could pass on, and she realized that in guiding him, she had discovered a deeper part of herself, a part that remembered the sweetness of youth, the depth of longing, the courage of first love, and the beauty of taking emotional risks even when the outcome is unknown, and she felt a quiet gratitude for the afternoon conversation that had started this journey, for the simple question that had unlocked so much, for the reminder that love, memory, and courage are never bound by age, and that the heart, when willing, can always find new ways to grow, to hope, to reconnect, and to embrace life fully. And so, holding the envelope, Margaret let herself breathe in the possibilities, let herself feel the tremor of hope, let herself remember that love had always been a teacher, that it had shaped her life in countless ways, that it could still surprise her, and that sometimes, the smallest question from a grandson could be the catalyst that transforms an ordinary life into one filled with reflection, courage, and the gentle, enduring magic of connection, so that even in the quiet moments, the ordinary days, the soft ticking of a clock, life can feel extraordinary, alive, and full of love waiting to be rediscovered.